Welcome. It was back in 1975 that I decided I was a communist. But for some time I couldn't declare the fact, make it public, because there was this Turkish Communist Party, and saying that I'm a communist meant belonging to that party, and that party was pro-Sovietic and made up of aparatchiki. So I couldn't say I was a communist. I had to hide it. Then came 1980, when there was a coup in Turkey, a military coup, and after that it was impossible to even mention the term communist. So I had to hide it again for a long time. In 1990, the old Communist Party dispersed, so my first reason didn't exist anymore. But there was still some legal possibilities of going to jail. So I was content with saying that I'm a revolutionary, I'm a socialist, going around the term. Then in 1995, the legal problems were already solved, and it was the time I could say, publicly declare that I was a communist. But wait a minute. When I said I was a communist, it was passé. Everybody looked at me as some kind of a guy from another century or something. I mean, communist, look, it's out of fashion now. And I felt like shit, really, and started saying I'm a socialist, I'm a revolutionary, something again. And by the time I became an academician in 2000, I went to some academic conferences, and whenever I made a quotation from Marx or Lenin or said something about communism, people looked at me like they saw something moving in their salad. I mean, and I endured this for 2 or 3 years, and I decided that I wouldn't care anymore. I decided that I wasn't going to apologize for being a communist. And my definition still stands. People still look at me as if they see something moving in their salad, some kind of a worm or something. But I'm content with that. Let us, if we call ourselves communists, be the moving thing in their salads. Because at least we're moving. They're not. With this, with having said this and justified myself as a communist, I will start with Zizek. Okay. Some years ago, he put out a call to repeat Lenin rather than return to Lenin. And, well, like everything Zizek said, it was some kind of, received some kind of a playfulness, you see? He's playing with words again. But, as a Turk, I grew up hearing a proverb: do what the imam says, not what he does. Imam is some kind of a religious person. And so, knowing this proverb, I understood what he meant. He was saying just the opposite. He was saying that do what the imam did, not what he said. By saying this, I will go over what Lenin said throughout his lifetime, because most of what he said I don't agree with. For example, in his 1908 book on materialist philosophy, Materialism and Empiriocriticism, that book was a little more than a lot of sophistry, written solely in order to discredit a fellow Bolshevik, Bogdanov, and contained little else. In 1920, he wrote a pamphlet called Left-Wing Communism, an Infantile Disorder, again to discredit Pannekoek and Gorta. And in that book, he substituted discipline for autonomous class action. In 1902, for God's sake, in What Is to Be Done, he was more Jacobin than Marxist. He was blatantly ridiculing freedom of criticism. But in the very same texts I mentioned, he also says some things I can unconditionally agree with. In 1908, he says that the basic controversy between materialism and idealism is not one to be resolved rationally or scientifically, but a matter of preference. I agree. In 1920, he states that revolution is not a matter of determination or intention, or how badly the working classes are exploited, but For a revolution to take place, it is not enough for the exploited and oppressed masses to realize the impossibility of living in the old way and demand changes. For a revolution to take place, it is essential that the exploiters should not be able to live and rule in the old way. And again, in 1902, in What Is to Be Done, he argues for a voluntary and organized subject against leaving everything to spontaneity. And this is a practical restatement of Marx's third thesis on Feuerbach. The materialist doctrine concerning the changing of circumstances and upbringing forgets that circumstances are changed by men and that the educator himself must be educated. The coincidence of the changing of circumstances and of human activity or self-change can be conceived and rationally understood only as revolutionary practice. Well, get used to this. I'm going to quote this sentence at least 5 more times. Slower. Okay. How slow? Okay. Now, we are talking about the same Lenin in all 3 instances, and it makes it rather hard to be a Leninist or an anti-Leninist as such, because he is self-contradictory, which is good. But throughout the 1917 revolutions, he was less self-contradictory. At a time of crisis, when none of the social actors in play was willing to take responsibility in a Russia torn by war and in a state of social and economic collapse, he forced his party against a very strong opposition to assume power. This is the same act which made Rosa Luxemburg fall in with the Bolsheviks in defending the 1917 revolution, despite the fact that she was profoundly critical of them. She says, thereby they won for themselves the imperishable historic distinction of having, for the first time, proclaimed the final aim of socialism as the direct program of practical politics. That's the Russian Revolution pamphlet. Of course, they were both expecting the rest of Europe fall in line with Russia, which didn't happen. Okay, now Lenin's statements were always tainted by the practical needs of the micro-power struggles of his day. 1902, he was arguing against Рабочее дело. In 1908, he was arguing against Bogdanov. In 1920, he was arguing against Panikov and Gorter. And by doing so, he consistently fell into the pragmatic trap. In 1902, he tried to maneuver away from the influence of the already reformist German social democracy of the time and ended up dismissing any critical interaction within the revolutionary party. In 1908, he wanted to eliminate a powerful rival, but he ended up in defending 18th century materialism instead of a Marxian one. In 1920, he wanted to neutralize a radical potential split in the Third International, and he ended up in demanding unquestioning obedience to the centralist line. In 1917, however, he was more or less free of the pragmatist trap because what was at stake was much greater than the petty internal struggles of the party. So he did what was necessary. So, the third thesis on Feuerbach, what he did in 1917 definitely belonged in a case of the coincidence of the changing of circumstances and of human activity that can be conceived and rationally understood as a revolutionary practice. Now, we shouldn't forget that states are far older than the idea of communism. We should obliterate all doubts otherwise that the primitive communities which existed before human beings organized themselves into states were close to or akin to a communist state of existence, because these communities, without even the most primitive conceptions of justice, freedom, or solidarity, were anything but. The naive belief that before the Greco-Roman slave societies or the Oriental despotic societies of Asia and North Africa, before the so-called Neolithic Revolution, there existed a primitive state of communal organization which was more or less free and egalitarian, This is an Enlightenment Rousseauesque legend, and we should get rid of it at once. Exploitation started way before that. According to Marx, it started in the primitive family, where the men exploited the women. Even before that, in what Freud called the patriarchal horde, there was one male who was the father, king, and God at the same time, who made the law but was not bound by that law and possessed all the women, all the children, even all the men, sexually and practically. And Freud says, as a fantastic moment in history, one day the brothers who had been driven out came together, killed and devoured their father, and so made an end of the patriarchal horde. This is how it ended. And what happened after that? The brothers made a pact among themselves in which they agreed not to step on others' property, on others' women. So, again, this was a male-dominated social form. This is the first form of justice. But it is nothing but organized injustice, differing from its precursor only in one point, that the makers and implementers of the rules are also bound by them. It is only then, however, that we can start to speak about freedom, because only now the individuals within a given community can appreciate and understand systematically the social communal necessities binding them. Hegel says, necessity is blind only so long as it is not understood. There is nothing, therefore, more mistaken than the charge of blind fatalism made against the philosophy of history when it takes for its problem to understand the necessity of every event. Hegel's famous phrase, forgive my German, Einsicht in der Notwendigkeit, Einsicht in die Notwendigkeit, insight into necessity, tells us that we're free only if we know the consequences of our acts. Okay. Only the people who know and appreciate, for example, if they smoke a lot of cigarettes, they may get lung cancer, are free when they decide to smoke or not to smoke. It doesn't say that when you understand this necessity, you shouldn't smoke. No, freedom is deciding through knowing the consequences. The existence, or rather coming into existence, of more and more complex form of human organization, laws, forms that are defined and delimited by human-made rules that grow into necessities in themselves, is what actually make people free in a social context. At the same time, however, it is precisely the existence of such laws, and therefore the existence of states built upon them, is what delimits human freedom. So the existence of political pertaining to the polis organization, and hence the state, is what makes even the idea of a communal, equal, solidaristic, and free condition of living together possible, but it is also what prevents it from becoming an actuality. The seeming paradox has been baffling revolutionaries of all sorts and creeds for centuries, and Marxists are no exception to this bafflement. Marx himself is an exception. The most popular shortcut out of this predicament is to dismiss the realm of politics altogether as some kind of a superstructure, replace it with the unmediated, non-political action of the masses, and voila, we have communism. Lenin, in even one of his most brilliant moments in The State and Revolution, falls into the same trap. He says, naturally, the exploiters are unable to suppress the people without a highly complex machine for performing this task. But the people can suppress the exploiters even with a very simple machine, almost without a machine, without a special apparatus, by the simple organization of the armed people. As in all shortcuts, Lenin makes everything appear very simple. What the people need is a very simple machine, a simple organization of the armed people. Of course, all the ideological and political mediation through which the people intervenes in the affairs of state are completely bypassed in this simple schematic. Since they are the majority and now that they are armed, the people should have no difficulty at all in suppressing the feeble efforts of the ruling classes to take back state power. After all, they are now, the former ruling classes, a disarmed minority. Of course, by eliminating political mediation, the simplistic solution almost entirely neglects the ideological and political differentiation within the people. Now, any differences among the political and ideological parties among armed people are reduced to the fundamental opposition between the exploited and the exploiter. And therefore, any kind of opposition against the dominant party can be dismissed as coming from the ideological representatives of the old order. Whether voluntarily or objectively, that is, no matter however you theoretically ground your opposition, you cannot avoid the position assigned to you by the objective law of the revolution, namely the position of representing the bourgeoisie, albeit unknowingly or unwillingly. This is the logic to be employed by the Bolsheviks in the years following the revolution, in annihilating the anarchists, exiling the Mensheviks, and disbanding and eventually outlawing the socialist revolutionaries. Slower. Okay. I just don't want to take much of your time. Okay. Which ironically make up the majority of the people taken together, anarchists, Mensheviks, and socialist revolutionaries. This shortcut does not only dismiss politics and ideology in one single stroke, but also makes the much more fatal mistake of confusing the people with the working class. In 1917 Russia, the proletariat was very far from being a majority. But wait a minute, it was far from being a majority anywhere else in the world. It was not only the underdeveloped capitalism in Russia that was the reason. Capitalism does not allow and has not ever allowed the proletariat to become a majority anywhere, in any era in history, not only economically, but also politically and ideologically. Some of the non-bourgeois lower classes never lose the hope of becoming bourgeois, at least petty bourgeois themselves, which fact prevents them from ideologically identifying themselves with the proletariat. A big portion of the lower classes have to be kept at bay without jobs in order to serve as the reserve workforce. And furthermore, some of them become chronic in this position for generations. These latter form Marx's dangerous class, the usual suspects that become the mass foundation for Bonapartism, fascism, and Nazism, and are politically and ideologically as far from the idea of communism as possible. Marx says, the dangerous class, the social scum, the passively rotting mass thrown off by the lowest layers of the old society may here and there be swept into the movement by a proletarian revolution. Its conditions of life, however, prepare it far more for the part of a bribed tool of reactionary intrigue. Yet another portion of the people distinguish themselves from the rest of the working class as regards their lifestyles, since they are more or less better paid and have administrative jobs, the service sector of today, which leads to a partial identification with the bourgeoisie. And there is always the mass of peasants